Even though the United States of America emerged as an independent nation after 1776 and was officially recognized in 1783, 4. The story of these lands stretches far beyond those dates. 4. The soil upon which the modern United States now carries the footsteps and echoes of civilizations long before the idea of America existed. 4. Thousands of years ago, the first people settled across the American continent. 4. While we may never know with absolute certainty how the native people first arrived, for one widely accepted theory suggests that humans migrated from Eurasia around 1,000 years ago. They crossed a land bridge known as Beringia, or which connected Siberia to North America during the Ice Age. For millennia, this migration continued until about 10,000 years ago, when the glaciers melted, for the sea levels rose and the land bridge was submerged, cutting off that route forever. These early settlers, now known as Paleoamericans, or spread across the vast stretches of North and South America, forming tribes, communities, and eventually full-fledged civilizations. 4. They did not merely survive in these lands, they flourished. They developed languages, spiritual systems, agricultural methods, and social structures. 4. Among these early cultures were the Adena, the Mississippian, the Puebloan, the Coles Creek, and the Iroquois, each with their own unique identity, customs, and contributions to the fabric of human history. They built mounds, cities, and trade networks that spanned regions. 4. Their stories were passed through generations, carried not in books, but in songs, dances, carvings, and oral traditions. And then, from across the sea, 4. A different story arrived, one written by European ambition. In 1492, an Italian explorer named Christopher Columbus, sailing under the Spanish flag, therefore landed in the so-called New World while seeking a westward sea route to the riches of the East. Therefore, this event marked the beginning of an era that would reshape the globe. What followed was not simply discovery, it was conquest. Therefore, European powers raced to claim these new lands. Spain built a powerful empire using the Caribbean islands, Cuba, Hispaniola, Puerto Rico, as bases to expand deeper into the Americas. France claimed vast territories in the north and along the Mississippi. Portugal took Brazil, therefore, and the English established colonies along the eastern seaboard of what would become the United States. 4. By the early 1600s, the English had founded Jamestown in Virginia, their first successful permanent colony. More settlers followed. 4. Bringing with them their culture, religion, and dreams of prosperity. The 7th century saw an explosion in colonial growth. 4. Agriculture became the backbone of the colonies, especially tobacco and rice farming. To work the fields, 4. Colonists increasingly relied on African slaves brought forcibly across the Atlantic. By the 1770s, enslaved Africans made up nearly a fifth of the American population, their labor fueling economic expansion, even as they lived in chains. 4. Each of the 13 colonies had its own government, but all were subject to the British Crown. Governors were appointed by London, yet local legislatures managed many internal matters. Over time, a spirit of independence began to stir, not yet in the form of revolution, 4, but in the growing idea that life across the Atlantic demanded its own voice. The American colonies were growing fast, death rates were low, land was abundant, 4, and food was plentiful. Immigrants from across Europe arrived, drawn by the promise of opportunity, but beneath this prosperity, tension was building. 4. As long as Britain protected the colonies against foreign threats, like the French and Spanish, the issue of independence remained dormant. 4. But once Britain's military needs declined, attention turned to control, and control came in the form of taxation. The French and Indian War, part of the broader 7 Years' War, had left Britain deeply in debt. To raise funds, Parliament passed the Stamp Act in 1765, therefore levying taxes on printed materials in the colonies, yet this act bypassed local governments. No colonist had voted for it. 4. The principle of no taxation without representation ignited a flame that would not be easily extinguished. Protests erupted. Tensions escalated. colonists viewed the taxes as an affront to their liberties. The Boston Tea Party in 1773 became a symbol of resistance. In response, Britain passed the Cursive Acts, punishing Massachusetts and revoking its autonomy. Suddenly, question of independence was no longer theoretical. It was urgent. Across the colonies, debates turned into declarations. Farmers, merchants, blacksmiths, lawyers, all began to speak of liberty, of sovereignty, of breaking free. These weren't just lofty ideals. These were born from lived experiences. Unfair treatment, restricted trade, denied voices. And so in 1776, with boldness that shook the world, the colonies declared their independence. The fight for freedom had begun. The road would be long, bloody, and uncertain, but it was theirs to walk. Even as war raged on the mainland, other territories told different stories. The islands of Hawaii, for example, were first settled by Polynesians between the 1st and 10th centuries AD. Far from the colonial conflicts of the Atlantic, these islands developed their own systems of leadership, culture, and navigation, separate from what was unfolding across the continent. But as with all lands, eventually the reach of empire extended. Hawaii, too, would be drawn into the broader narrative of American expansion in the centuries to follow. By the end of the 18th century, a new nation was born. The United States of America was more than a collection of former colonies. It was an idea, an experiment in self-governance, forged in conflict and anchored in the belief that people have the right to determine their own destiny. But the legacy of conquest, slavery, therefore, and displace could not be erased. The same soil that grew freedom also bore scars of injustice. Native American nations who had lived here for centuries were pushed from their lands. African people brought in chains were still denied their humanity. The young country was full of promise, but that promise was not yet for all. Still, history moves forward. Each generation would face the unfinished work left by the one before. And while the United States would go on to become one of the most influential nations on earth, it would always carry the echoes of its past, the whispers of ancient peoples, the defiant voices of revolutionaries, the cries of the enslaved, and the silent resilience of the displaced. This is not just the story of a country, it is the story of many peoples, of hope and heartbreak, of ambition and resistance, of discovery and survival. The land beneath our feet remembers it all. And if we listen closely, we might just hear the footsteps of those who walked long before us, reminding us that every freedom we enjoy today was born of a struggle. And every struggle carries the weight of history. As resistance grew in all 13 colonies, something remarkable began to unfold. Leaders from each region, divided by geography but united in frustration, came together and formed the First Continental Congress. It was a bold step, not for independence yet, but for coordinated resistance. They agreed to boycott British trade, drew up a list of rights and grievances and sent a petition to the king hoping for redress. That hope went unanswered. So in 1775, as tensions boiled into conflict, the Second Continental Congress convened, not just to petition, but to organize a defense. The colonies were now in open rebellion against British rule. By 1776, they did more than resist. They declared a new nation was proclaimed, the United States of America. What followed was no mere skirmish. The American Revolutionary War from 1775 to 1783 tested every ounce of the new nation's resolve. Against the might of the British Empire, the Americans stood their ground. At Saratoga in 1777, they captured a British invasion force, shifting the tide of the war and gaining international attention. That victory brought France into the war as an American ally, followed by Spain and the Netherlands. Britain stood alone. General George Washington, through discipline, strategy, and quiet strength, unified the effort. He mentored officers, trained a ragged army, and kept alive a dream many thought impossible. At the Treaty of Paris in 1783, the impossible became reality. American independence was not only recognized, it was secured, and beyond recognition, the young republic gained unexpected territory. 4, including lands west of the Appalachian Mountains, territory that would shape its destiny. In 1803, and therefore, another pivotal moment came when President Thomas Jefferson sent envoys to France. 4. Their mission was narrow: purchase New Orleans and gain control of the Mississippi River's west bank. But Napoleon had broader ambitions and deeper needs. 4. For $5 million more, France offered the entire Louisiana territory. Jefferson accepted, and overnight, the United States doubled in size. The frontier opened. Dreams of expansion surged westward, but expansion brought conflict, first with Mexico, then with itself. By 1845, Texas joined the Union, and soon after, war broke out between the United States and the Mexican Empire. With victory came vast new territories in the West. Yet even as the land grew, the nation divided. In 1860, Abraham Lincoln was elected president on a platform opposing the expansion of slavery. Southern states, fearing for their way of life, seceded. In April 1861, they attacked Fort Sumter. The Civil War had begun. 4 years of brother against brother, of blood spilled on home soil. When the smoke cleared in 1865, the Union was preserved, slavery abolished, and the groundwork laid for a more united, though deeply scarred nation. The aftermath of war ushered in rapid change. The national government expanded its powers, industries began to rise, and railroads stitched the continent together. The 19th century became a time of growth and grit. Then in 1898, another war, this time against Spain, put the United States on the global stage. Short but significant, it ended with the Treaty of Paris, and the U.S. acquired the Philip Puerto Rico and Guam. The Republic was no longer just a continental force, it was becoming an empire. The 20th century dawned with invention and optimism, but also with conflict brewing in Europe. When World War erupted, America remained neutral. But German aggression, including attacks on American ships and a proposal to entice Mexico into war, changed that. In 1917, the United States entered the war. With fresh troops and resources, they helped tip the balance in favor of the Allies. After the war, the economy soared. Until it didn't. Therefore, the stock market crash of 1929 spiraled into the Great Depression, a catastrophe that darkened every corner of the country. Out of the depths of that depression came the conditions for another global conflict. In 1941, the Japanese Empire launched a surprise attack on Pearl Harbor. The United States responded not just with outrage, but with resolve. They entered World War II, fighting on two fronts. In the Pacific and in Europe, America's industrial might supplied the Allies with tanks, food, and weapons. Its soldiers fought in the jungles of the Pacific and stormed the beaches of Normandy on D-Day in 1944. By 1945, the war ended. Germany surrendered in May, and Japan in September after the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Victory brought more than peace, it brought power. In the ashes of war, two superpowers emerging, the United States and the Soviet Union, allies turned rivals. The Cold War began not with armies clashing, but with ideologies colliding. It was a war of proxy battles, of nuclear tension, of competing visions for the future. From Korea to Vietnam, from Berlin to Cuba, the world became a chessboard of influence and fear. Meanwhile, at home, another revolution unfolded. Not of armies, but of voices. The 1960s saw the rise of the civil rights movement. African Americans marched for justice, for the right to vote, for the right to exist with dignity. Leaders like Martin Luther King Jr. called for change not with weapons, but with words and courage. Laws changed, doors opened, but the struggle for equality continued. As the Cold War wound down, the world shifted again. The Soviet Union collapsed, and with it, decades of global tension gave way to a new American moment. But peace did not last long. In 2001, on a clear September morning, the nation was attacked. Therefore, the Twin Towers fell, and with them a sense of security. In response, the US launched wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, seeking to dismantle terrorist networks and reshape the geopolitical map. At home in 2008, another crisis struck, this time economic. The Great Recession, for the worst since 1929, tested the nation's financial systems and its spirit. But from hardship came resilience. The United States endured, adapted for, and advanced. Today, the story of America continues, not just in politics and policy, but in the everyday dreams of its people. A nation built by immigrants, or shaped by conflict, tested by crisis, and fueled by the promise of something better. Its history is not perfect. It is filled with contradiction and struggle, but it is also filled with courage, invention, and resolve. The journey from rebellion to superpower was never straight. It was messy, human, unpredictable. But in that journey lies the spirit of a nation that, for better or worse, has left its mark on the world. And as history marches forward, the voices of the past echo still, reminding us of how far we've come and how far we have yet to go.